The House comes now to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, in the name of the Honourable Annette.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. Does he have confidence in all his ministers?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
If he has
Supplementary question, the
Sorry,
Honourable
Mr
Annette
Speaker.
King.
If he has confidence in his Minister for Women, why did he tell the media in relation to the Chiefs scandal that he speaks for the government and, quote, so Louise Upson may have thought that's good enough?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Because firstly, I think it's well-accepted convention that the Prime Minister does speak for the government across a range of portfolios, and that's why the journalists ask me across a range of portfolios, and actually it's why the opposition ask me every day across a range of portfolios. Secondly, I made that statement when I was overseas in, I think, either Ponape or Laos, and the point I was making was I wasn't sure exactly of what statements entirely that Louise had made on her behalf, but she would have seen my comments, and if she'd seen my comments, she would accept that I'd be speaking for the government.
Supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Does he think he's got credibility to speak for women in light of his own behaviour repeatedly pulling a ponytail of a woman, rather than the Minister whose job, he said, is to advocate for women?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes I do, and I didn't see the member making a comment yesterday when I gave what I thought was a pretty hard-hitting speech actually on domestic violence. The member criticised me for making that speech.
I certainly did not. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Has he subsequently asked the Minister for Women to make an effort to speak out for women on the behaviour of some rugby officials and players, having refused to speak up on the grounds it's entirely a matter for the rugby organisation, or is he happy for it to be left to those who have got the guts to confront attitudes in our national sport?
The
Speaker,
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
No, I think the Minister's been quite correct that she is the government's sort of party to the particular inquiry. Actually, I looked at the Minister's statement, and the Minister's statements were quite hard-hitting in a generic sense, but she doesn't have the exact information about this particular case.
Well, supplementary question, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Annette.
Well, in light of that answer, having decided himself to speak out on behalf of the government, does he think his comments such as disappointing and unacceptable are strong enough when compared to the Minister of Police, Judith Collins, who said, quote, it's time they stopped that stupid behaviour, grew up and apologised?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes, I think members opposite will know I'm always a very measured person.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Will he give an assurance that he will pass on his displeasure at the activities to the Chiefs players who are currently All Blacks when he next meets them? If not, why not?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I don't have all of the details, so I can't tell you exactly the individuals' players' names, but in terms of discussions with the Rugby Football Union, I think the Rugby Football Union itself has been making the very point, let alone me, that they think this behaviour and the events of a Monday sort of layer up are not a good idea.
Do you speak up or not?
Order. Supplementary question. Order. Order. I'm trying to call a supplementary question at the end of the House, and I don't want a continued interjection. Jan Logie, supplementary question.
My supplementary to the Prime Minister is, how can the Prime Minister value the role of the Minister of Women when he has placed it outside of Cabinet, given it the least funding of any ministry, and is now propping up a minister unwilling to support women challenging our culture of violence?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, there's a range of portfolios that from time to time are outside of Cabinet. It just depends on who we think has the best skills actually to conduct those. But let's be honest, that member's been outside of government for the entire time they've been in this parliament. And maybe that does explain why they've done nothing since they've been here.
Order. Supplementary question. Order. Order. Point of
Speaker,
order.
you would have heard the last two sentences of the Prime Minister's answer. Demonstrably, they are not allowed in this House by any past ruling by you, so why do you condone it from him?
Order. No, the last two parts of the answer was certainly not helpful to the order of the House, I accept that, but there was no word in there that I would have said was unparliamentary at the time. Supplementary question? Order. Mr Mark, if you continue to interject and criticise my rulings, you'll get the same treatment as I gave to Mr Peters yesterday. Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can he guarantee the Minister for Women was not told to keep quiet on the chief scandal by any of his ministers?
The Right Honourable
Mr.
Prime Minister.
Speaker, no, the Minister's free to discuss the matters, but she makes the right point that she doesn't have the details.
Order. Order. You can repeat the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can he guarantee the Minister for Women was not told to keep quiet on the chief scandal by any of his ministers?
The
Mr. Speaker,
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
well, I am not aware of any minister that has told the Minister of Women not to comment on this matter.
Order. Question